The Arizona sun rose like a blade of fire over the jagged red mesas, cutting the horizon into sharp lines of light and shadow. The desert was already awake with heat, even though it was only morning. Luke Harrington slammed the tip of his hammer into the warped cedar post, driving a nail through the cracked wood of his corral. The sound rang across the empty ranch like a gunshot, swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. Sweat traced thin rivers down his sun-browned face, soaking the collar of his faded shirt. At 45, Luke looked like a man carved from the land itself, lean, weathered, and unyielding. His gray-streaked hair curled damp beneath his hat, his skin tanned to a leathery bronze after years of working under the relentless sky. He paused, resting one hand on the rough fence, and looked out over the barren stretch of earth that he called home. The drought had been cruel this year. Months without rain had left the ground cracked like broken pottery. The small creek that used to wind behind the ranch house had dried up to nothing but dust. The cattle grazed near the last standing tufts of dry grass, their ribs faintly visible beneath patchy hides.
Every morning, Luke checked the water in the troughs like a man guarding treasure. His well was holding, barely, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. He removed his hat and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, scanning the horizon. No clouds, just the endless sweep of desert, sagebrush, cacti, and the occasional tumbleweed dragged along by the hot wind. The silence out here was heavy. For some men, it would feel like prison walls closing in. For Luke, it was both punishment and salvation. 4 years ago, Mary had died in this house, her fever burning through the coldest winter he could remember. He'd done everything he could, but the prairie can be merciless, and medicine was scarce. After she was gone, Luke had buried her beneath the old cottonwood near the creek and turned his back on town life. People had come to offer their condolences, but every kind word cut like a knife. In the end, it was easier to live with the cattle, the silence, and his own thoughts. Sometimes, when the night grew still and the stars shone like white fire above the desert, he would sit on the porch and open her Bible.
The leather was worn soft from her hands, the pages marked with faint underlines and her neat handwriting. Mary believed in kindness. She had told him once, "If you can save a life, Luke, you do it, no matter who they are." Luke's life since then had been one of habit and quiet survival. He rose before dawn, boiled coffee on the old iron stove, fed the horses, and walked the fence line with his tools slung over his shoulder. The days blurred together, broken only by the occasional trip into town for supplies, a place where he barely exchanged words with anyone, except a nod to the storekeeper. Today was just another day in the desert's endless cycle of sun and silence, or so he thought. As Luke leaned his hammer against the fence post and reached for a coil of wire, he heard something faint, a sound carried on the wind, almost lost in the dry hiss of the sagebrush. It wasn't the bleat of cattle or the cry of a hawk. It was different, faint, weak, a ragged sound like someone calling out from far away. He froze, squinting toward the shimmering horizon. For a long moment, there was nothing but the waves of heat rising from the ground.
Then he saw it, a speck of movement, unsteady and slow, weaving through the dying grass. Luke narrowed his eyes. At first he thought it might be a stray cow or a traveler's horse, but no, this was different. The figure staggered, then dropped to its knees, barely able to rise. Something inside Luke tightened. People didn't just wander out here without reason, not in this heat. Luke dropped the coil of wire without thinking and reached for his hat. The figure was moving all wrong, unsteady, as if the heat itself were pushing it down. He started walking, then quickened to a long stride, boots kicking up puffs of dust. As he drew closer, the shape of a young woman came into focus. She was barely standing, her arms trembling at her sides, her steps faltering like those of a wounded bird. By the time he reached her, she collapsed face first into the brittle grass. Luke knelt beside her, rolling her gently onto her back. She was native, Apache by the look of her dark braids and beaded dress, though the garment was torn and stained with sweat and dust. Her lips were split and bleeding, her skin scorched by the sun. He could see the faint pulse at her throat, weak and erratic.
"Hey." Luke's voice was rough from disuse. He tapped her cheek lightly, but her eyes fluttered open only for a second. They were deep brown, unfocused, shimmering with fever and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry, cracked whisper, something in a language Luke didn't understand. Her hand twitched, reaching upward, as if asking for something invisible. "Water," Luke muttered. He yanked his canteen from his belt, twisted the cap, and lifted her head carefully. Easy now, just a little. He tilted the canteen to let a single trickle fall between her lips. She tried to gulp, but he pulled it back. "Slow," he said. "Too much and you'll choke." She managed to swallow, eyes closing as if that single sip had bought her a moment of life. Luke gave her another, just enough to wet her throat. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin. If he didn't get her inside soon, she wouldn't last an hour. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, light like dry kindling. Her head fell against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. He turned back toward the ranch, the heat pounding down on him like a hammer. Every step felt urgent.
Inside the small wooden house, Luke laid her on his bed, the coolness of the shaded room a slight relief against the midday inferno. He poured a little water into a tin cup, dipping a rag to dampen her forehead. "Stay with me," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear. Her lips moved, forming a word he couldn't catch, maybe a name. A faint beadwork pouch hung around her neck, its strings frayed, its colors faded. He recognized it as something precious, an heirloom. Luke fed her tiny sips of water and broth through the afternoon, pausing whenever her breathing grew shallow. More than once he thought she was slipping away. But near sunset, her eyelids flickered open again. This time, the gaze was clearer. "You saved me," she whispered. Her English was accented but soft, deliberate. Luke hesitated, caught off guard by the clarity in her voice. "Anyone would have," he said, but even he knew that wasn't true. These lands were full of men who wouldn't have stopped, men who would have turned their backs. Her eyes studied him, as if she could see something deeper than his weathered face and dust-covered shirt. "No," she murmured, "not anyone." Luke shifted his weight, uneasy under her gaze. "What's your name?" "Naya," she said weakly. "It means the one who rises in my people's tongue." "Well, Naya, you nearly didn't rise again," he replied with a rough humor, though his voice softened. "I'm Luke Harrington. This is my ranch." Naya's eyes moved around the room, taking in the sparse furnishings, the old Bible on the shelf, and the smell of wood smoke. "You live alone?" she asked. Luke nodded, jaw tightening. "Used to be me and Mary, my wife." He didn't say more, but the shadow crossing his face was answer enough. Naya looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding of loss, of solitude that needed no words. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his rough hands together. "What were you doing out there in this heat?" "We were traveling," she said faintly. "My grandmother and I. We lost our way. She gave me the last of the water." Her voice broke, and Luke didn't need her to finish the sentence. He nodded quietly. He understood sacrifice. He understood how love could drive someone to give their last breath for another. And as he looked at the frail girl lying in his bed, he realized that her fight for life had just begun, and so had his. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The walls of Luke's cabin were cool compared to the punishing heat outside.
He laid Naya gently on the bed, the springs creaking under her light frame. Her breathing came in shallow, quick bursts, like the flutter of a trapped bird. Luke reached for the basin, filled it halfway with the precious water from his well, and dipped a clean cloth. As he pressed the damp cloth against her forehead, he could feel the heat radiating off her skin. She was burning up. "Easy now," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He took the tin cup and poured a small amount of water, lifting her head with one hand. Her lips parted automatically, dry and cracked, and she swallowed as though every drop was a lifeline. She murmured something, a soft string of syllables in Apache, words he couldn't understand, yet the tone was clear. It sounded like pleading or prayer. Luke had heard prayers before, whispered in desperation on battlefields during the war. There was a kind of universal sound to them, something that cut through language and time. "Don't worry," he said gruffly, though he knew she couldn't understand. "You'll pull through. I won't let you die here." He kept a slow rhythm, dampening the cloth, spooning a bit of weak broth he quickly made from dried vegetables and a scrap of salted meat. He held it to her lips. When she coughed, he waited patiently. The hours stretched long, marked only by the ticking of the old clock and the soft creak of his chair as he shifted beside her. As evening settled in, the cabin grew darker. Shadows from the desert sunset painted the wooden walls in strokes of deep orange and violet. Luke lit the oil lamp, its warm glow casting a circle of light over the bed. He looked down at the girl, at the sharpness of her cheekbones, the copper tone of her skin, and the streak of dust running along her jawline. She seemed impossibly young, not yet 20, and far too fragile to be lying here between life and death. He noticed her feet, blistered and swollen, the soles cracked and bleeding in places. She must have walked for miles in the heat. Beside her, hanging loosely from a leather cord, was a small pouch decorated with beads and feathers. Luke picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it, a charm of some sort, maybe a keepsake from her people. He placed it gently back on her chest. At one point, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze wandered, unfocused, but then settled on him for a moment. He felt something strange in that brief glance, a mixture of fear, confusion, and perhaps gratitude. "You're safe," he said softly, the roughness of his voice softening without him realizing. "Rest now, I'll keep watch." The night wore on. Luke sat beside the bed, dozing and waking in turns, checking her breathing, offering sips of water whenever her lips moved as though dreaming of rain. Once she whispered something that sounded like a name, an old woman's name, perhaps. Her face twisted slightly, as if remembering a pain too deep to voice. Luke leaned back, rubbing his temples. He'd seen men dying of thirst during the war. It was a slow, cruel way to go, the body breaking down as every ounce of strength drained away. He wasn't about to let that happen again, not under his roof. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of dry earth. Inside, the cabin became a quiet battlefield where life and death wrestled in silence, and Luke, this solitary rancher, had chosen his side. By the third day, the fever began to break. Luke awoke with a stiff neck from sleeping in his chair and found her watching him with a quiet intensity. Her brown eyes were clearer now, though ringed with exhaustion. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, strangers who had shared the silence of life and death. "You," her voice cracked, rough from days without water. "You," Luke cleared his throat, "did what anyone would have done." She shook her head faintly. "Not anyone." He glanced away, uncomfortable under her gaze, and busied himself with the kettle on the stove. "Name's Luke Harrington," he said after a moment. "This here's my place, just a small cattle ranch, nothing fancy." Her lips curved slightly, though the gesture barely resembled a smile. "I am Naya." "That your given name?" he asked, pouring a cup of warm broth. "Yes,"
she whispered. "It means the one who rises, but I did not think I would rise again." Luke handed her the cup, supporting her back as she drank. "You're tougher than you look," he muttered. "Walking out there alone in this heat, that's a death sentence." Her eyes lowered to the blanket pulled over her knees. I wasn't alone. She reached instinctively for the small beadwork pouch that lay on the bedside table. My grandmother walked with me until she could no longer walk. The weight in her voice told Luke everything. He didn't need to hear the rest to understand. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight bled across the horizon, Naya sat propped up on the bed, her hair freshly combed, and her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea Luke had brewed. Her voice grew steadier as she told him her story. "We were traveling to meet my father's band, to the north," she said, her gaze fixed on the far wall as though she could still see the open plains stretching before her. "The rivers had dried. We lost our path. The water we carried, it ran out 2 days before we reached your land. My grandmother gave me her share, even when I begged her not to. She said I must keep walking." Luke felt a dull ache in his chest. He had known the kind of love that gives without hesitation. Mary would have done the same for him, without question. "What happened to her?" he asked gently, though he already guessed. Naya's eyes darkened, her fingers tightening around the pouch. "She gave me all she had left, and then she lay down in the shade of a dry tree. I buried her with my own hands. The earth was so hard. I could only cover her with stones. I sang to her spirit, but I was afraid, so afraid I would join her soon." Luke didn't know what to say. Words of comfort felt hollow. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening, and stoked the fire in the stove. The next day, Naya managed to step outside. She stood barefoot on the porch, leaning on the doorframe as she gazed out at the barren fields. "This land," she murmured, "it is sick, like the desert is holding its breath." Luke followed her gaze. "Ain't rained in months. Cattle are thin. Crops are dead. I've seen dry spells before, but not like this." She looked at him then, her expression both curious and solemn. "And yet you gave me your water." Luke shrugged, though inside her words struck something deep. "Water don't mean much if you let someone die next to a full well," he said quietly. When night came, they sat on the porch together, a soft wind whispering through the sagebrush. Naya clutched her pouch, her thumb brushing over the beads as if each held a memory. "This was my grandmother's," she said. "She told me that if I found a man of good heart, I should give him this. But I do not know yet if you are that man." Luke glanced at her, half a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess I'll have to earn it then." The days slipped by with a strange, unspoken rhythm. Luke found himself adjusting his routine, not out of inconvenience, but because the ranch felt different with Naya there. Her presence filled the silence he had grown so accustomed to. She moved quietly, as if respecting the solitude he cherished, yet every small sound she made, a soft footstep, the gentle rustle of her dress, reminded him that life had returned to this place. By the 5th evening, Naya had enough strength to help with small chores. She insisted on sweeping the porch and tending the meager vegetable garden that had managed to survive the drought. Luke had tried to stop her at first, but her determined glance silenced him. She worked with the same patience and care Mary once had, pulling weeds with deft fingers, humming a tune under her breath. "You don't have to do that," Luke said, leaning against the fence post, watching her work. Naya looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I want to," she replied. "It is good to make something live, even if it is only a few leaves in this dry earth." Her words sank deep into Luke's chest. He hadn't thought about life in that way since Mary's passing. To him, the ranch had become a place of mere survival, a stubborn fight against the land's indifference. But Naya's presence made him notice the details again. The smell of the dry sage at dusk, the colors of sunset when the mesas burned gold and crimson. That night they sat on the porch together, the horizon glowing with the last embers of the sun. Luke handed her a mug of coffee, though she only sniffed at it, amused by the bitterness.
"In my people's tradition," she said softly, "we believe the Great Spirit lives in the wind and the mountains. We listen to the earth for guidance." Luke sipped his coffee, leaning back in his chair. "Mary used to say something similar, though she called it God's voice." He paused, looking out at the fading light. "She always believed we're meant to care for each other, no matter who we are." Naya tilted her head, studying him. "She must have been a good woman." "The best," Luke said, his voice low. He didn't talk about Mary often, but with Naya the words came easier. She could make a home feel alive just by being in it. When she died, this place got quiet. Too quiet. Naya glanced down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I know that kind of quiet," she whispered. "When my grandmother died, the world felt empty. But she told me before she left, 'Don't let grief turn your heart to stone. Find life again, Naya.'" Luke looked at her then, really looked. There was strength in her, hidden under the exhaustion of survival. She wasn't just a girl who had been saved. She was someone who carried the weight of her people and her past with quiet dignity. In the days that followed, they shared more moments like this, simple, wordless connections. Luke taught her how to saddle one of his horses, her laughter ringing out when the animal tried to nudge her with its nose. In return, she showed him how to find water signs in the desert, pointing out a patch of greener grass near a dry creek bed. Each evening they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. Sometimes Luke would read a passage from Mary's Bible. Sometimes Naya would hum a soft Apache song, its notes carrying an ancient sadness and hope. Luke began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet warmth stirring inside him, as if the desert itself was whispering that life could bloom even after years of drought. The desert mornings grew sharper, as though the land itself sensed something stirring beyond the horizon. Luke noticed the first sign one day while he was repairing the outer fence line. A column of dust twisted faintly in the distance, lingering far longer than the wind would allow. It wasn't natural, too steady, too deliberate. He knew what it meant. Riders. He tried to keep his thoughts calm as he walked back to the ranch. It could be settlers from town or ranch hands driving cattle, but deep down Luke's gut told him otherwise. He'd heard stories these past months, rumors of Apache bands moving more frequently across the plains, searching for missing people, or defending sacred land from encroaching settlers. If they found Naya here, would they believe the truth? Or would they see him as just another white man who'd taken something that wasn't his? That evening he didn't tell Naya what he'd seen. She sat cross-legged on the porch, sewing a loose tear in her dress with thread Luke had found in Mary's old sewing kit. The setting sun painted her face in amber light, but her eyes were distant. "You're thinking about your people," Luke said, his voice low. She paused, nodding. "They will be looking for me. My father will not stop until he finds out what happened to my grandmother and me." Luke's jaw tightened. "If they come here, will they believe me when I saved you?" Naya lowered her gaze. "My father is Chief Greyhawk. He is a good man, but he has learned to be cautious of your people. Too many promises have been broken, too many lies told." She looked back at Luke, her expression softening. "You're thinking about your people," Luke said, his voice low, "but I will speak for you." Her words were meant to reassure him, yet they only made his chest heavier. A single misunderstanding could lead to bloodshed, and Luke knew what a war party of Apache warriors was capable of if they believed their chief's daughter had been harmed. The next day, Luke rowed out to check the water levels in his well. The rope creaked as he lowered the bucket, and the splash that answered sounded weak, shallower than before. He cursed under his breath. Drought was one enemy, but now there was another. On the ride back, he spotted the dust again, closer this time, just over the ridge to the east. He stopped his horse and studied it, his jaw clenching. There was a rhythm to the movement, a cadence only hooves could make. Whoever they were moving fast. When he returned, Naya was standing by the corral, watching him with sharp eyes. She had noticed his unease. "What is it?" she asked. "Riders," Luke said simply. "Too far to tell who they are, but I don't like it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It might be my father's scouts." "Or it might be men from town," Luke countered. "If they find you here, they'll think I'm harboring a runaway or worse. Folks don't take kindly to Apaches." "Then what will you do?" she asked quietly. Luke looked past her, out at the horizon where the land burned in the evening light. "I don't run from what's right," he said finally, "but I've seen how fast things can go wrong when fear takes over." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Luke sat by the window, watching the moonlit desert and listening to every whisper of the wind. Somewhere out there, someone was coming closer. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this ranch, his quiet refuge, was about to become the center of something far larger and more dangerous than anything he'd faced before. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing day. Luke found himself staring out over the desert more often, scanning the horizon for dust clouds or distant silhouettes on horseback. The waiting stirred something deep inside him, something he had long tried to bury. That night, he sat on the porch with Naya, the stars scattered across the sky like cold fire. She hummed a low, haunting tune, her voice carrying the sorrow of her people. Luke listened, his hands resting on his knees, the melody tugging at memories he had locked away. The Civil War had left scars on Luke that no one could see. He remembered the smell of black powder, the sound of men screaming as they fell in mud and blood. He had been younger then, his spirit not yet hardened by loss. He saw flashes of faces he couldn't forget, friends who never made it home, men who died with his name on their lips, asking for help he couldn't give. Mary had been the only light after those dark years. She had taken his broken pieces and made him whole again. Her gentle faith and steady hands had pulled him back from the brink. When she died, Luke had felt the old darkness creeping in, whispering that he was meant to live alone, to carry his grief like a badge. But now, as he looked at Naya, this young woman who had fought to survive against all odds, something stirred inside him. She reminded him of what Mary used to say. "Kindness is not weakness, Luke. It's the only thing that saves us in the end." Naya noticed his silence. "You are far away tonight," she said softly, her English tinged with the gentle lilt of her Apache tongue. Luke gave a humorless chuckle. "I was just thinking about the war, about things I'd rather forget." "War leaves ghosts," Naya replied, her gaze fixed on the desert horizon. "We carry them until we face them." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He glanced at her, seeing in her eyes a reflection of his own pain, the loss of family, the weight of survival. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "I've been running from mine for years." The following day, Naya sat beside him in the corral as he mended a saddle strap. She told him more about her people's beliefs, about the path of honor, how saving a life created a bond that tied spirits together. "My grandmother believed that every meeting is chosen by the Great Spirit," Naya said. "She said if I ever survived a great trial, it would be because someone was meant to help me, someone chosen by fate." Luke paused, the leather strap in his hands.
He wasn't sure he believed in fate anymore, but there was something about her conviction that made him wonder. Could it be that this girl had been sent to remind him that his life wasn't over yet? That night, as he sat by the fire inside the cabin, Luke stared at Mary's Bible on the shelf. He reached for it, his fingers tracing the worn cover.
He whispered a quiet prayer, not just for Mary, but for Naya, for the ranch, for the storm he felt was coming. The sound of distant hoofbeats suddenly cut through the stillness of the night. Luke stood, his heart pounding. They were closer now, too close to ignore. The sound came at first like a faint drumbeat rolling across the empty desert floor. Luke stood on the porch, the morning sun already high, and listened with growing unease. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't cattle. It was rhythmic, relentless, hooves pounding the earth. Naya stepped outside, her long black hair loose around her shoulders, and froze. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition. "They are coming," she said quietly. "My people." Luke's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the doorway, but he stopped himself. He wasn't about to meet 300 Apache warriors with a gun in hand. That would only invite bloodshed. Instead, he squinted toward the horizon. A dark line moved steadily in the heat shimmer, like a storm cloud crawling across the ground. Within minutes, the dust grew thicker, the sound of hooves louder. Luke climbed onto the roof of the cabin to get a better look. What he saw made his stomach tighten. At least 300 riders stretched in a long formation, their horses moving in perfect rhythm. The sun caught the glint of their lances and rifles. Bright war paint and feathers marked the leaders. This wasn't a small scouting party. This was a show of strength. Naya's voice rose from below. "That is my father," she called, pointing to the center rider, where a tall man with gray-streaked hair rode a black horse. "Chief Greyhawk." Luke climbed down, his boots thudding on the dry earth. His mind raced. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and this could end in fire and blood. The war party slowed as it approached the ranch. Dust rolled like smoke around them. The front line of riders stopped about 200 yards from the fence. The chief, tall and commanding, raised a hand, and the warriors fell silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the horses and the wind whispering across the dead grass. Luke walked out from the porch, stopping just beyond the gate. He didn't carry a weapon, just the steady calm of a man who had already seen too much death. Beside him, Naya stepped forward, her small figure framed by the harsh sunlight. "Wait here," Luke murmured to her, but Naya shook her head. "I must speak first." Chief Greyhawk urged his horse forward, breaking from one line of riders. He stopped about 30 yards away, his piercing gaze fixed on Luke. The chief's voice carried across the space, deep and resonant. He spoke first in Apache, words Luke couldn't understand. But Naya answered, her tone quick and urgent. After a tense exchange, the chief's dark eyes settled on Luke. "You are the man who found my daughter?" he asked, in careful English. Luke nodded, keeping his voice steady. "She was dying in the heat. I gave her water, food, and shelter." Greyhawk studied him, his expression unreadable. "Many of your kind would not have done so." "I'm not many men," Luke replied. A silence followed, thick with unspoken questions. The warriors behind the chief shifted on their saddles, their eyes watching Luke like hawks. He could feel their suspicion, their readiness to defend their chief's blood. Naya spoke again, her voice clear and firm. "Father, he saved me. Without him, I would have died beside grandmother's grave." Greyhawk's gaze softened slightly as he looked at his daughter. Then he turned back to Luke. "If your words are true," the chief said, "then today will not be a day of war." Luke felt his chest loosen, but only slightly. He knew this wasn't the end, only the beginning of a far more complicated moment. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The air was tense enough to cut with a knife. Luke stood at the gate of his ranch, the dry wind tugging at his shirt as the war party came to a halt. The pounding of hooves died away, leaving only the snorting of horses and the whisper of dust settling back to the earth. 300 Apache warriors sat in perfect silence, their faces painted with streaks of red and black, their eyes sharp as obsidian. At the center of the line, Chief Greyhawk was unmistakable. His black stallion was draped with beadwork and feathers, and his posture was as steady as a mountain peak. The man's hair, streaked with silver, fell in 2 long braids over his shoulders. His gaze locked on to Luke, assessing, unyielding, like a hawk studying prey, or a man measuring another's soul. Luke's fingers twitched near his belt, but he made no move toward the rifle resting on the porch. He had seen enough death to know that one wrong gesture would ignite a storm of violence. Instead, he stood tall and unarmed, his weathered hands hanging loosely at his sides. Greyhawk raised his hand, and the riders behind him obeyed with the kind of discipline Luke had once seen in seasoned soldiers. A command was shouted in Apache, its tone sharp and commanding. The words were unfamiliar to Luke, but the meaning was clear. Who are you, and why are you here? Before Luke could speak, Naya stepped forward. Her bare feet pressed into the dry earth, and her voice trembled as she called out in her native tongue. Her words came fast and full of emotion, a plea, a reassurance, a declaration of truth. Tears glimmered in her eyes, and even from where he stood, Luke could hear her voice crack when she said, "Grandmother." The chief's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of grief crossing his features. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion, landing on the ground with the quiet power of a man who carried both respect and authority. His eyes softened for only a heartbeat as he looked at his daughter, before hardening again when his gaze returned to Luke. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Luke met Greyhawk's eyes, the weight of 300 warriors pressing down on him. He swallowed once, steadying his voice. "My name's Luke Harrington," he said, his voice carrying across the open space. "I found your daughter dying of thirst in my field. I gave her water, that's all." The chief's face betrayed nothing, but Luke could feel the judgment in the man's eyes, like an arrow waiting to fly. Chief Greyhawk stepped forward, the leather of his moccasins silent against the dry earth. His presence was commanding, not just because of the warriors behind him, but because of the gravity in his dark, intelligent eyes. He stopped a few paces from Luke, close enough that Luke could see the weathered lines etched into the chief's face, a map of battles fought and years endured. "You say you found her," Greyhawk said, in deliberate English, each word carrying the weight of an unspoken challenge. "But why? Why would a white rancher risk his life for an Apache girl when most of your kind would leave her to the sun?" Luke shifted his stance, feeling the scrutiny of not just the chief, but every warrior standing behind him. "Because she was dying," he said simply, "because no one deserves to die alone in the dirt." The chief's gaze narrowed slightly, studying Luke's face for any sign of deception. "There are men who would have taken her, men who would claim kindness but mean harm." Luke felt his jaw tighten. "I'm not that kind of man." Greyhawk tilted his head slightly, as if testing Luke's words. "Your kind has broken promises to mine," he said. "Your soldiers have burned villages, stolen land, killed children. Do you expect me to believe you are different?" Luke drew in a slow breath, his voice firm but calm. "I fought in the war back east. I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. I'm not proud of everything I've done, but I know this much. If you can save a life, you do it. Doesn't matter if that life is Apache or white, man or woman. It's just the right thing to do." A murmur rippled through the ranks of warriors, quiet but noticeable. Greyhawk raised a hand, silencing them instantly. His expression softened by the faintest degree. "You speak like a man who has seen truth," he said, "but words are easy. Trust is not." Naya stepped closer, her hand brushing against Luke's arm as she looked at her father. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, "he gave me water when I had nothing left. He treated me with respect. Without him, I would not be standing here." Greyhawk's eyes lingered on Luke, still hard, but now with a glint of something else. Respect, perhaps. The silence after Naya's words felt different, less tense, but no less heavy. Greyhawk's eyes moved from his daughter to Luke, as though measuring something deeper than mere gratitude. He folded his arms across his chest, the beads and feathers on his sleeves catching the sunlight. "In our way," Greyhawk began, his voice low but steady, "when a man saves the life of a chief's child, he is no longer just a stranger. He becomes part of the family, bound by honor and duty." Luke frowned slightly. "I didn't do it for honor," he said. "I just couldn't let her die." The chief tilted his head, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. "Perhaps that is why it means something. True kindness does not ask for reward, but our people do not forget such deaths. We honor them so they will never turn into shadows of mistrust." Luke shifted his weight uneasily. "What are you saying?" Greyhawk looked directly at him, his voice rising enough for the nearby warriors to hear. "I am saying that by saving my daughter, you have tied yourself to us. My people will not take back what is freely given. But bonds must be made strong. A bridge must be built." Naya glanced at her father, her eyes wide, as if she sensed what was coming. Greyhawk turned to her briefly, then back to Luke. "There is a way to make peace certain, to turn this day from one of fear into one of unity." He took a slow step closer. "I offer you my daughter's hand. If you choose, she will be your wife. Through this union, you will be under the protection of my tribe, and we under yours. 2 lives saved instead of 1. Luke felt his breath catch. Marriage? He hadn't thought beyond the moment he had found Naya in the field. The image of Mary rose in his mind, her smile, her laughter, and for a brief moment his heart ached with both memory and guilt. Naya lowered her gaze, silent, waiting. She neither resisted nor showed fear, only quiet acceptance of what fate had set before her. Luke met Greyhawk's eyes, searching for any hint of manipulation, but found only sincerity. "You'd do this to make peace?" The chief nodded once, solemnly. "To honor life, we must sometimes begin anew." The words hung in the hot, still air, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Luke felt the weight of every gaze. 300 Apache warriors, all silent, watching this moment unfold. His hands flexed at his sides, his heart caught between confusion and a strange, rising warmth he hadn't felt in years. Naya stepped forward, her bare feet stirring the dust. She looked first at her father, then at Luke. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, searching calm. "Father," she said softly, "I owe this man my life. But it is not only because he saved me that I stand here." She turned to Luke, her gaze unwavering. "You gave me more than water, Luke Harrington. You gave me hope when I had none.
I thought I would die alone, and yet you reminded me what it means to keep walking, to keep breathing." Luke's throat tightened.
He wasn't a man who cried easily, not after all he'd seen in the war and in life. But something in her voice struck deep, like a chord that had lain silent for too long. I didn't do anything special," he said hoarsely. "Just tried to do what was right." Naya shook her head gently. "Kindness is never small. My grandmother told me that the Great Spirit sends people into our lives for a reason. I believe she sent me to your field so we could both find something we lost." Luke glanced at Chief Greyhawk. The chief's expression was unreadable but solemn, as though this moment held significance far beyond just the two of them. Luke took a step closer to Naya. "This marriage," he said quietly, "is it something you want or just what your father wishes?" Naya's eyes softened. "I will not do what I do not choose," she said, her voice firm despite its gentle tone. "And I choose to honor what is between us. You are a man of quiet heart, but I see the goodness in you. If you will have me, I will stand beside you." Luke's breath caught. For the first time in years, he felt something warm and steady take root inside him, a sense of belonging he thought he'd buried with Mary.
He swallowed hard, meeting her gaze. "Yes, I'll have you, Naya. If that's truly what you want, then so do I." The tension of the moment gave way to a quiet murmur among the warriors, as though the desert itself exhaled in relief. Chief Greyhawk raised his hand, calling for silence. "Then it is settled," he said. "Today we honor life, and we honor the bond forged by courage and compassion." Preparations began swiftly, yet with reverence. A circle was drawn in the dirt before the cabin. The warriors formed a wide ring, their faces solemn but approving. Some dismounted, tying their horses and gathering bundles of sage and sweetgrass. Naya moved gracefully, her hands trembling only slightly as she plucked a few wildflowers from Luke's meager garden, tiny blossoms of yellow and white that somehow survived the drought. Luke stood awkwardly by the porch, tugging at the collar of his cleanest shirt, the one Mary had sewn years ago. He caught himself smoothing it down, almost embarrassed, as though Mary might be watching from heaven and teasing him for his nervousness. The ceremony began with the burning of sage, its smoke curling into the hot air like whispered prayers.
Greyhawk spoke first in Apache, his voice steady and resonant. Though Luke didn't understand the words, he felt the weight of them, the sense that this moment bound more than two lives. It was a bridge between two worlds. When Greyhawk finished, Naya turned to Luke and placed the small beaded pouch, her grandmother's keepsake, into his hands. "This is my family's blessing," she said softly. "It is yours now." Luke swallowed hard, feeling the texture of the beads, the weight of trust they carried. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Then it was Luke's turn. He reached into his pocket and took out Mary's small leather-bound Bible. He opened it to a page she had once marked, Proverbs 17:17. "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." Luke's voice trembled slightly as he read, but the words felt right, bridging his past with the promise of the future. As the final blessing was spoken, a distant rumble rolled across the sky. Heads turned upward. The clouds, heavy and gray, gathered as though drawn to witness the moment. A single raindrop fell, splashing dark against the dusty ground. Then another. And then, like a miracle, the heavens opened. The warriors laughed and raised their arms to the sky, letting the long-awaited rain drench their faces. Naya smiled through the downpour, her hand finding Luke's.
For the first time in years, Luke felt alive, truly alive. The rain fell in sheets, soaking the hard earth that had been starved for months. The dry cracks in the soil softened, drinking greedily from the sky. Luke and Naya stood side by side, their hair plastered to their faces, watching as the desert transformed before their eyes. It felt like a blessing, something more than just weather. The warriors cheered, their voices mingling with the rolling thunder. Some dismounted, dancing in the rain, their feet kicking up wet dust that quickly turned to mud. Others tilted their faces skyward, arms spread wide, laughing as if the Great Spirit himself had sent this storm as a sign of approval. Luke closed his eyes for a moment and let the cool drops wash over him. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of renewal. For so long, the ranch had felt like a graveyard of memories. Every fence post, every empty room, echoing with Mary's absence. But now, standing here with Naya's hand firmly clasped in his, he felt something shift.
Later, as the rain eased to a gentle drizzle, Luke walked the ranch with Naya at his side. The small creek that had long since dried up was flowing again, a silver ribbon winding through the brush. The cattle, weary and thin, came forward to drink, their sides brushing one another as they crowded near the water. Naya watched them with quiet wonder. "The land is breathing again," she whispered. Luke looked at her, struck by the simple beauty of her words. "Yeah," he said softly, "maybe we are too." Chief Greyhawk approached, his boots wet and his face shining from both rain and pride. "Today you are no longer alone," he said, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder. "You are family now. My people will remember what you have done." Luke nodded, his throat tight. "I'll take care of her," he said, glancing at Naya. "She's safe here, always." The chief gave a single respectful nod. "Then the spirits have guided us well." That night, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, Luke sat with Naya wrapped in a warm blanket. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, a song of renewal. Luke glanced at Mary's Bible on the table and felt an unexpected peace.
"I think she'd be happy for me," he said quietly, almost to himself. Naya looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then let's honor her by living." And for the first time in years, Luke believed he truly could. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The storm lingered well into the night, soaking the thirsty desert until the ground smelled rich and alive again. By morning, the air carried a freshness Luke hadn't felt in months, a clean, earthy scent that spoke of renewal. The sun rose slow and gold over the mesas, glistening on the wet grass and the tiny rivulets of water that still trickled through the low ground. Luke stood on the porch, boots damp from the mud, watching as the Apache warriors prepared to leave. They were quieter now, no longer an army braced for confrontation, but a group of proud men who had witnessed something extraordinary. Some of them nodded at Luke, a silent gesture of respect that carried more weight than words ever could. Chief Greyhawk approached, his stallion's mane still wet from the rain. "The land smiles today," the chief said, glancing at the glistening horizon. "It is a sign. The Great Spirit approves of what was done here." Luke inclined his head, not quite sure how to respond. "Maybe so," he said. "Feels like the land's been waiting for this rain as long as I have." Greyhawk placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, the grip firm and steady. "You are not alone now. My daughter is your wife, and our people will remember your kindness. If ever you need us, we will come." Luke met his eyes, seeing not just a chief, but a father who loved his child. "And she'll have a home here. You have my word on that." Naya stood a few steps away, speaking with two of the elder women who had accompanied the party.
They embraced her, blessing her with quiet chants and giving her a small woven blanket marked with the symbols of her tribe. When she turned toward Luke, her face was radiant, not just with the glow of the morning light, but with something deeper. "They are leaving," she said softly as she joined him. "Father says this is a new path for both of us, a path of peace." Luke nodded. "Guess that makes two of us finding new roads." As the war party rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the bright horizon, a calm settled over the ranch. The only sounds were the gentle creak of the windmill and the soft murmur of water flowing through the creek bed, music to Luke's ears after the long silence of drought. Later that day, Luke and Naya worked side by side in the barn. The cattle, now well fed and drinking from the replenished troughs, seemed more lively, nudging each other with playful energy. Luke leaned on a fence rail, watching them. "Looks like we're not the only ones getting a second chance," he said. Naya smiled, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "Life always returns, if we are patient. The earth remembers how to heal itself." Luke thought about her words as they moved through the day, mending fences, gathering what little harvest they could save from the garden, cooking a simple meal together. He found himself noticing small things he had ignored for years. The warmth of another presence beside him, the laughter that slipped from Naya when a horse nibbled at her sleeve, the way the evening light turned her dark hair into a crown of fire. That night they sat on the porch as the sky deepened into twilight. Luke handed her a tin cup of coffee, and for the first time she didn't wrinkle her nose at its bitterness. "Do you think the rain will last?" she asked. "Long enough," Luke said with a small smile. "Long enough for us to see what comes next." He didn't say it out loud, but he felt it, a quiet certainty that his life had shifted for good. The loneliness that had haunted him for so long had been washed away by the storm, and by the woman sitting beside him. The days following the storm carried a feeling Luke couldn't quite put into words. The desert had come alive again. Tiny green shoots pushed through the once barren soil, and the air held the scent of wild sage and wet earth. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. Something within him felt lighter, as though years of grief had finally loosened their grip. One evening, Luke walked alone to the small wooden cross he had built for Mary on the hill behind the ranch. He hadn't visited it in months, perhaps because every visit had left him hollow, his heart stuck in the shadows of what he'd lost. But tonight felt different. The ground was soft beneath his boots, still damp from the rain. He knelt by the cross, brushing away the dust that clung to it, and placed a single wildflower at its base, one Naya had found near the creek earlier that day. "Mary," he murmured, his voice breaking just slightly, "I think you'd like her. She's strong, kind, the kind of woman who'd give you her last drop of water if you needed it. I hope you don't mind that I've let someone in. I think it's what you'd want for me." A warm breeze rustled through the grass, and for a moment Luke almost believed it was Mary's way of answering. When he returned to the porch, Naya was sitting by the railing, brushing her long hair. The evening sky stretched above them, painted with soft purples and golds, and the first stars blinked faintly in the west. "You went to see her grave," Naya said softly, not as a question, but as an understanding. Luke nodded. "She was a good woman. She believed in kindness, in helping people no matter who they were. I think maybe that's why I couldn't leave you in that field." Naya smiled, her gaze distant. "My grandmother used to say that kindness is like water. It finds its way, even through the hardest ground." Luke let her words settle between them, feeling the truth in them. He reached for her hand. "I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to face it alone anymore." Over the next week, life on the ranch began to take on a new rhythm. Naya's presence turned simple routines into something more. Her laughter made the silence feel warm rather than empty.
Her quiet humming while cooking made the cabin feel alive again. They worked together, planting seeds in the freshly softened soil, tending the animals, and repairing what the drought had nearly broken. Greyhawk sent word through a scout that the tribe was safe, their summer camp thriving now that the rains had returned. He also sent a message: "You are part of our story now. Guard it well." Luke read the note by lantern light, his heart swelling with a strange mix of pride and humility. For so long he had been a man without a tribe, a man without purpose. Now he felt connected to the land, to Naya, to something larger than himself. On their first Sunday together, Luke took out Mary's Bible and read a few passages aloud as Naya listened. She didn't know every word, but she understood the spirit of it. When he finished, she told him an Apache story about the Great Spirit bringing rain to the earth after a long season of fire. In that moment, Luke realized something profound. Faith, whether spoken in English or Apache, was still faith. And love was universal. As the sun set that night, Luke and Naya stood hand in hand, looking out over the glistening fields. "Sometimes," Luke said quietly, "giving water to a stranger means you end up watering your own soul." Naya leaned her head on his shoulder, and he felt an unshakable peace. For the first time since Mary's passing, Luke Harrington wasn't just surviving, he was truly living. In the heart of the untamed West, a lone rancher and a resilient Apache girl discover that kindness can bridge even the deepest divides. True Wild West Stories brings you tales of courage, loss, and hope, stories that stir the soul like a distant song carried on the desert wind.